And the other thing that my lab has been extremely interested in are some of the things that decrease the likelihood. So caffeine consumption and primarily cigarette smoking appear to decrease the incidence of it. And so there's still environmental factors, but like what's in those things that are causing it? Like those could be insights and ways of potentially decreasing the progression.
So caffeine consumption and cigarette smoking actually predict lower incidence of Parkinson's. I've
Yeah.
actually heard both of these things, and I wanted to ask you about the latter and if we knew anything more specific about it. But that is in fact an observation that's true.
Yeah. So the caffeine one is very well studied, and I think that because we have so much data on caffeine and coffee and tea consumption, and even where people drink decaffeinated beverages, like so you can kind of tease out that part of it. So that one's been pretty strong, and the adenosine signaling seems to be a big part of it. The tobacco and the cigarette smoking has been harder to get at because tobacco smoke is very complicated, thousands of molecules in it. And so a paper from Haida Payami at University of Alabama, Birmingham, probably about 12 years ago, really shifted a lot of my research. So she was doing a genome-wide association study to look at drivers of Parkinson's. But besides just looking at whether or not you get it, she was aware of this effect of smoking. And she's like, well, what if we did a GWAS to see if something was modifying whether or not cigarette smoking was protective?
Hmm.
And in that study, she identified a protein called the synaptic vesicle glycoprotein 2C, SV2C. And then they said, well, this could this is just humans. It's smoking, very complicated thing. And so she did work in Drosophila. So went to a fly model, treated them with a toxicant, and then used nicotine to see if she could protect from it.
Pure
And
nicotine.
then redid the GWAS in flies and pulled up the ortholog to SV2C.
So that term ortholog, what you're basically saying here is we're talking about a protein that is part of the synaptic vesicles that importantly store the dopamine that we were talking about before. And I think what you're getting at here is that this must be a highly conserved protein that has a similar core function in vesicles in flies and other animals, including humans.
Yes. And when I saw that, like to me, when you look at the environmental factors in Parkinson's, the smoking protection is actually stronger than like the pesticide making it worse. And it's like this really jumped out to me. And so when I heard about this data, and I knew one of the co-authors, I called up Haida right away and was like probing her for information. So my lab went and knocked out SV2C in mice. When that paper came out, there were only like 8 references to SV2C in the literature.
Wow. So it's this core protein, highly conserved, but it was not well
totally understudied. Yeah. A member of the family, SV2A, is the target of Keppra or levetiracetam, which is like the biggest selling anti-epilepsy drug. So SV2A was really well known, but SV2C, no one knew anything about it. So we knock it out in mice. And then we measure how well they release dopamine using voltammetry. And when you did that, they release less dopamine.
And that would predict protection against Parkinson's.
Well, they released less. They had less dopamine, so they were actually lower functioning. Like the idea is when you didn't have SV2C, you couldn't store dopamine as well into the vesicle.
Okay, so it did not store as well in the vesicles and therefore got oxidized more, presumably, and that would be a problem.
But it was really nice kind of confirming her results. And now since then, SV2C has shown up just in regular GWAS for Parkinson's as being an independent genetic risk factor for it. But it lives on that vesicle, which my lab has been studying for years. And so my lab has been working on SV2C ever since then.
Yeah. And so obviously there's a huge bag of worms here because we're talking about nicotine. But with respect to this result, nicotine appears to have this anti-Parkinsonian effect. Is it fair to say that's established?
Yeah, so and there's nicotinic receptors on the dopamine neurons, and there's many different pathways involved with nicotine. But another study from some colleagues, about Alberto Serio at Harvard, did a study on nutrition, looking at people that had diets high in food that were high in nicotinoids. And they had a lower incidence of Parkinson's.
So nicotinoids would just be any compound that can activate a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor?
Yeah, a lot of peppers.
Okay.
Like,
So
and
these
so
are
the
Nick.
idea is that it once, like a lot of people at first were saying, is it something about smokers and
Right.
addictive personality sort of thing? But the idea that nicotinic foods could also have the protection, made us think that it very much was the nicotine and not something else in the
Yeah.
cigarettes.
So the fly study, the GWAS study in flies that you mentioned, specifically used nicotine. So there's one piece
Yeah,
of evidence,
exactly.
and now this
Yeah.
other piece of evidence is this more general observation that nicotinoids, foods with nicotine-like compounds, have similar pharmacology. They have repeat the observation one more time. They have lower incidence of Parkinson's.
With the mice,
The dietary thing that you just mentioned,
the
people that
diet,
can,
so the people that had diets high in the nicotinoids
yeah,
had a lower incidence of Parkinson's.
okay,
So the more nicotine you take in, it appears to be protective to Parkinson's disease.
wow, interesting. And then caffeine as well has some kind of effect.
Yeah, so caffeine seems to do a similar effect. Now, caffeine and coffee consumption has been shown to have positive health associations for many different things. So I have no problem encouraging people to drink coffee and tea. We've been doing it for thousands of years. But cigarette smoking, we know increases the incidence of about 100 other diseases. So
Right, right.
the idea of like cigarette smoking being there
Mhm.
seems something that you can't do. But the idea that, that activating that system, one of my initial sort of very simplistic ideas of this was, is like the nicotine exercising the dopamine neurons? Like, is it making them fire more? Like, the idea is that, like, we know from other studies that people that start getting Parkinson's disease, they start moving less.
Mhm.
And that's being sedentary makes everything worse. The idea is you need to keep these neurons going. And so the idea is that physical activity is something you always want someone who's in the early stages because it seems to help that. So is the nicotine kind of artificially activating and exercising the neurons? Is one of the ideas that might be why it has that protective effect.